My dad passed away a while ago, and my wife and I decided to have my mother move in with us and our two little ones, so that she could spend her last years surrounded by her family and not feel my dad's absence so much. The problem was that we were living in a small 2-bedroom apartment, and although we had some money saved up, it still wasn't enough to buy a house, so my mother decided to sell her home in Virginia and help us buy our house in Maryland. She insisted that she would rather invest that money in helping us buy a house where she could spend the rest of her days with us than pay for a nursing home, something she would never want. The problem was that there was a lot of stuff to move and clean in that house before we could list it for sale. So one day I got up the courage and went back to the house to start the cleaning job. I started on the first floor and then went up to the second floor and finally made it to the attic. When I got there, I realized that it was full of family memories. It was like a time capsule. I found everything: photo albums of vacations in Hawaii, pictures of my childhood, my graduation photos, and even my Dragon Ball card collection, which I thought I had lost years ago. But among all the hidden treasures, I also found a folder full of important documents, such as my parents' marriage certificate and birth and death certificates. It was in this way that I realized that my last name, the one I had carried all my life, was not the real one. My parents at some point decided to change our family name. I remember this happened when I was very young, so it's not unusual that I didn't remember it, but as you can imagine, curiosity got the better of me. I began to wonder why someone would make such a change. Were we running away from something? Hiding some secret? So as soon as I had the chance, I decided to talk to Mom about it. Sounds a bit dramatic, I know, but I had been thinking about this before. Finally, when the kids were at school and my wife was at work, I knew it was my chance to have that conversation with my mom. So I sat down with her while she watched TV in the living room, a little fearful of her reaction, as gently as possible. I asked her for a moment and showed her the documents I had found related to the last name change. I imagined there was going to be some sort of reaction, a surprise, or some sort of excitement. But instead, Mom seemed resigned. She already knew that eventually I was going to find those papers during the cleanup, since this was not the same house I had grown up in, but a place that had been owned by them for years. And at first, she was a little worried. But considering that this had all happened over 30 years ago, it was as if she knew this day would come at some point. During the conversation, she revealed to me that there was an uncle I had never heard from, as he had passed away when I was still a baby. It was a difficult moment, especially since no one had ever told me about him. But I understood that Mom must have her reasons for keeping all this a secret, so I waited for her to reveal it to me herself. However, the truth was more complicated than I thought, and that only increased my thirst for answers. It turns out that the circumstances of her death generated a real scandal, and to avoid reporters and vigilantes coming down on them, my parents opted to change our last name and move across the country to start over. I think my mom didn't want to tell me the whole truth, and it was like watching her deal with a huge internal dilemma as she talked to me about this issue for the first time. I know her very well, so it was obvious to me that she was trying to dodge what really mattered. So I ended up asking her directly so she would spill the story how it really was, and without any more beating around the bush. After hesitating for a few seconds, she finally gave in. And this was what she told me in a nutshell. Apparently, my uncle and my future aunt met in college. They had an affair that was pretty shaky, and my dad knew that had every chance of ending badly. But all of a sudden, they pulled out the hype and announced that they were engaged. Dad thought it was only a matter of time before it all blew up, so he didn't expect much from that marriage. However, as the wedding approached, he slowly realized why his brother was so hooked on her. It turns out that my aunt's family was super rich, from that money that has accumulated over generations. And well, she was one of the heirs to that juicy family wealth. They owned a chain of canning factories and also had vineyards, she told me. This was big business at the time, so in short, they were loaded with money. Dad was always clear that marrying for interest was not ideal, but my uncle didn't want to hear it and ended up marrying her in a fancy ceremony at a beautiful property in the countryside, attended by a lot of important people. It seems that the first few months of marriage were like a fairy tale, but then everything went back to normal. As I told you, they had a very troubled relationship and were always in conflict about something. So between fights and arguments, rumors of annulment and divorce began to circulate. But the couple moved on, and my uncle had become too used to that lifestyle to let it go. However, sometime later, an accident happened that changed everything. On their first year of marriage, my aunt and uncle went hiking in a mountainous area, and my aunt apparently took a pretty nasty fall. My uncle immediately took her to the hospital with very serious injuries. But fortunately, despite her delicate condition, the doctors managed to save her life. However, after the operation, the family received the terrible news that she would never walk again, and that it was very unlikely that she would regain the use of her arms. As I told you, this tragedy changed everything in their lives. At first, it was just the vicissitudes and complications of the condition of my uncle's wife, who, after much therapy, barely managed to move her right hand. But later, her family began to blame my uncle for what had happened to her. Since she was incapacitated, it was he who took her place in the family company, and this did not please them at all, especially her older brother, who was the general manager of the company. This man always thought that my uncle was a gold digger and was convinced that it was not a simple accident with his sister, but that my uncle had provoked him to get rid of her. But the worst storm came later. One night, my uncle's wife took a whole bottle of sleeping pills and died of intoxication. This fact in itself was a tragedy and a scandal. But the real storm came when the policeman who lifted the body found inside her pillow a letter in her own handwriting, where she confessed what had really happened. And it turned out that her brother was not so wrong. She did not fall off the cliff by chance, but my uncle pushed her after a fight. In that letter, she confessed that she hadn't said anything because she loved him, and he had apologized to her, telling her that he hadn't done it on purpose and that he loved her too. She said that during her recovery, he had been wonderful to her while taking care of business matters. However, she had recently discovered that he had a mistress and knew she could no longer move on. As you might imagine, this set off a whirlwind, and in the midst of all the chaos, my uncle went on the run, leaving all the pressure of his wife's family on his own family. While on the run from justice, my uncle disappeared from everyone's radar. No one ever heard from him again, not even my grandparents. But his wife's family was convinced that he did, and that they were hiding him. The scandal and drama that ensued made my father decide it was best to change course. I never imagined that a simple last name could hide such a dark history, full of secrets and difficult decisions. It wasn't until 4 years later that my uncle was found in Hawaii, where he had also changed his identity and had managed to camouflage himself among the locals during all that time. However, the same night he was captured, he took his own life, hanging himself with his own shirt. I was completely stunned as I listened to this chilling story, and I reproached my mother for never telling me about it. She told me they planned to tell me when I was ready, but honestly, who decides that? In the end, they put it off so long that they chose to keep it a secret. They were afraid that revelation would ruin the perception we had of our family and cause us unnecessary trauma. I don't know how I would have handled that if I had to carry that secret as a young man. But, as a parent, I can understand why they did it. I support their decision. Sometimes you have to keep secrets. At a certain age, truths can make you feel like you're being stabbed or shot. I've seen kids grow up knowing too soon. They become adults before their time, and it stays with them. At first, I was a little upset to learn that they had kept all that from us. But then I understood that they only did it to protect us. In the end, I feel grateful that my mother finally revealed this truth to me, as dark as it is. But I think we all have a right to know our family history, no matter how dark it is. When I was a little girl of about 9 or 10 years old, my family stopped making visits to my grandmother's house on Mom's side. Truth be told, I didn't realize that it happened until much later, and when I finally noticed it, I didn't think much of it. Sounds a bit cold of me, I know, but at the time, even though I was a child, I understood that the subject was quite sensitive. At that age, I couldn't imagine what serious thing could have happened so that my mother could stop talking to her own mother. The very idea scared me a little, so I just kept it in a corner of my head, as children do. Eventually, however, I was told that the reason they weren't talking to each other was because they had a horrible fight one day, and decided it was best not to see each other again. As far as I knew, the relationship between them had never been the best, even when Mom was little. But honestly, I didn't want to ask more about it, because it was such a sad topic, and every time Mom brought it up, it brought tears to her eyes. As a result of this very complicated and hostile relationship between the two of them, as I grew older, I began to feel a kind of contempt for my grandmother. I didn't know exactly what she had done, but it was clear that she had left my mother heartbroken. There was no other way to describe it, so in my mind, it was easy to forget about someone who had hurt my mom so much. I didn't care if we were family or not. However, a few years ago, around November 2018, Mom called me to give me some news that chilled me to the bone. It turns out that my grandmother was very sick and dying. She told me that if I wanted to see her before she departed this plane, I had to do it soon, or there wouldn't be another chance. I felt a little overwhelmed because I didn't know if I should go see her or not. Everything changed for me at that point, and I started thinking about the possibility of visiting her where she was, whether it was a hospital or a nursing home. But when I asked Mom where she was, her answer blew me away. To begin with, I must say I was a little surprised to learn that my grandmother was still alive, as I had assumed she had already passed away and we never found out. So, knowing that we had one last chance to reconcile was an unexpected twist in the story. I asked Mom if she was planning to go see Grandma and make up with her, and when she said no, I asked her exactly where she was. There was a pause for a few seconds, and then she revealed to me that she was in Illinois, in a place called Chittenden. I didn't know what to think. I was torn. On the one hand, I felt I should do the right thing and say goodbye to my grandmother. But on the other hand, there was so much resentment built up. It had been so long since I had seen that woman who had left such deep marks on my mother's life that I didn't even know if she would recognize me or if she would be grateful for my Masita. After some thought, I decided I had to go. I couldn't let the opportunity to close that chapter slip away, so I began to prepare my things, feeling a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. What was I going to say to her? How was she going to react? Everything was a whirlwind of emotions inside me, and I was still uncertain if I was making a good decision. The name Chit didn't ring a bell at all, and honestly, it shouldn't have. So, like any good, curious person, I phoned Mom and asked her what the hell this Chit thing was. She went silent for a few seconds again, and then without losing her composure, explained to me that it was the name of the place where my grandmother was living. Some sort of residence for people like her or something. But then slowly, and with a tone in her voice that made me shiver, she blurted out, "Honey, Your grandmother is in prison. In that instant, I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I was silent and wide-eyed for almost a minute. You know when someone asks you if you're sitting down because they have some difficult news to give you? Well, I realized why they do that. It's not like I was blacking out or anything, but for those very long seconds I was disconnected from reality. I was stuck in a loop of thoughts trying to process what I had just heard. It was as if a bunch of questions were forming in my mind at the same time, and they didn't dare to come out. A fleeting thought flashed through my head. Should I go to my mother's house and talk about this in person? But I couldn't wait any longer. Curiosity was getting the better of me. So in the end, I ended up pinned on the couch, my head in my hands, begging my mom to tell me the whole story. Because they had clearly skipped a part, the most important part probably. That's when she told me the missing part, and I was speechless. As I mentioned, I knew my mom's childhood was a whole mess, and Grandma was at the center of that whole storm. I won't say she was a psychopath, because that would be an insult to those who really are. Because according to my mom, Grandma's cruelty was calculated, not uncontrolled insanity. I won't go into all the details of the abuse Mom endured. It would be like sitting here all day listening to sad stories. But believe me when I tell you that my grandmother was undeniably a horrible mother. Mom endured her verbal, physical, and psychological abuse for many years, until one day, after much suffering, she realized that just because her mother hurt her didn't mean she had to continue that cycle. This happened right around the time I was born, and I guess it was a sort of wake-up call for her about what being a mother really means. Surprisingly, Grandma tried to change her attitude a bit during that stage, perhaps because she realized that if she didn't, she would never have a relationship with her grandchildren. So until I was about 9 years old, we would see her or she would come to see us a couple of times a month. Everything was relatively quiet until all of a sudden, Mom got a call from a guy claiming to be my grandmother's lawyer. The news was blunt. She was behind bars, and the charges against her were very serious. When we got to this part of the story, I really didn't know what to think. It was as if suddenly everything I had believed about the family was falling apart, and I was in shock trying to understand how I never knew any of this. How had this secret gotten this far? It all seemed like something out of a TV series, but here I was, learning about this dark family secret. Ahead of me was a chance to visit someone I had avoided and condemned in my mind for half my life. And now, the situation was completely different. Because instead of reliving old grudges, there was a new reality to face. How could a person so hurt and hurtful in the past need my attention now? Questions raged in my mind like a storm, and the uncertainty of what I was going to do was beginning to fill me with doubts. I was about to embark on an emotional journey that I had never anticipated, and that could completely change the way I viewed my grandmother. Mom told me that at first she suspected that Grandma's legal problems had to do with some sort of DUI incident. She thought maybe she had crashed a car because she was drunk, or God forbid, that she might have hurt someone. Anyway, the subject took a dark turn, and Mom started asking the lawyer about the bail process, something she had never had to do in her life. And at that point, the lawyer blurted out that my grandmother's bail was about $500. Zero! Mom got a knot in her stomach when she heard that figure. She already knew that for a bail of that magnitude, things were serious. She knew that Grandma had screwed up to the core, and it wasn't just a simple altercation, but that there was something much worse behind it all. And she soon proved that she was not wrong. The lawyer revealed to my mother that Grandma was being charged with 4 counts of attempted murder, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and, to top it off, 1 count of being an accessory to murder. In short, what really happened was that the grandmother had been getting into trouble with her neighbors, a family of 2 young professionals with 2 children. We never knew exactly what had happened between them, but instead of opting for something simple like moving or putting up a higher fence, the grandmother decided to fix the situation in another way. She went online to look up how to hire a hitman. Can you imagine that? She simply typed in Google how to hire a hitman, and after quite a while browsing, she ended up exchanging emails with a guy who claimed to be a professional at that. But the craziest thing about it is that she was ready to spend all her savings on this hitman to get rid of her neighbors in the most brutal way possible. But karma came to her right away, and in the way she least imagined. Grandma wasn't actually talking to a hitman, but to an undercover police officer who was there to catch her. If this were a movie, it might even seem comical. A little old lady trying to hire mobsters for a simple garden thing, but there was nothing funny about the reality. This just evidenced that this woman was a psychopath. I'd like to think she's someone dealing with some kind of never-diagnosed mental disorder, which doesn't justify how she made my mother's life a living hell for her first 20 years. But the truth is that the more I learn about her, the more I become convinced that her actions were never really motivated by a mental problem, but an all-too-dark evil she harbors in her heart. My mother recalls that when she confronted my grandmother about it, she showed no remorse or regret whatsoever. She could not believe that her mother was willing to sacrifice a fortune only for the family next door to suffer. Even those poor, innocent children who had no idea that the evil old woman next door was planning to make them orphans. Just thinking about it makes me shudder. How far can that woman's wickedness go? After learning of all this madness, I decided I didn't want to see her, and a month later, news came that the grandmother had died in prison. Officials reported that her last words were addressed to a former cellmate and that she did not mention her family at all. Sometimes I think that if I had wanted to visit her, I wouldn't even have been recognized by her. And truthfully, that wouldn't matter to me, because knowing the truth about who this woman was, who unfortunately became my grandmother, I wouldn't have recognized her either. It is a relief to think that that stage of her life was over and the story she left us, though tragic and twisted, would no longer drag me down. You've probably heard stories about cruel stepmothers who mistreat their husbands' children in horrible ways, but mine was nothing like that. Mine was a completely different situation, as the monster in my life was my own mother. From a very young age, I realized that I needed to escape from home because the abuse I was suffering was so much that I couldn't stay there a second longer. So one day I took a handful of jewelry that I had taken out of my mother's safe and hit the streets. I had no other plan, just to sell them and give myself a chance to start over, wherever and however I could, but away from the hell I was living at home. I had a hunch that my mother might send someone after me, but not because she cared in the least, but because I was her scapegoat. The truth is that I was born to be her emotional punching bag, someone on whom she could vent all her anger and frustrations in the cruelest ways possible. My birth was not a happy moment for her, but a constant reminder that she had married my father solely for money, without a shred of love involved. I have no idea why my dad tolerated that relationship for so many years and never separated, because even I, being so young, could sense the resentment between them. My mother never minded showing me that to her I was just her husband's daughter, whom she totally despised, and therefore me too. I remember that whatever my dad did that bothered her, she would take it out on me. She would beat me, punish me for no reason. Humiliate me in horrible ways. She would always deflect all her anger at me instead of confronting him. I endured all this torment for 15 years, hoping that at some point she would realize that I was not only my dad's daughter, I also had his blood running through my veins. But things never got better. So one day I decided I had had enough. One night, after she went to sleep, I hid the keys to her safe, and with my heart in my throat, I got up the courage and stole the money and jewelry that was in the safe and ran out of there. The first thing I did was to exchange the jewelry at a pawn shop not far from my house. And as soon as I got out of there, I put the money in my backpack and took the subway to the other side of the city. I didn't know anyone, but I managed to stay in a homeless shelter and stayed there for a year, during which time I was living on the money I got for the jewelry, which of course was much less than what it was actually worth. As you can imagine, I dropped out of school, but I met some people who were very supportive and, in a way, became my family and protected me during the time I was homeless. Among them was Selma, another girl who ran away from home to escape the abuse of her adoptive parents, but that's another story. The fact is that she had just turned 18, and thanks to that, we were able to rent between the two of us a small annex in a modest neighborhood. I also got a job in a grocery store and started earning some money. There was a Starbucks cafe just across the street, so whenever I could, I would sneak out to observe what was going on there. And one day, while waiting for the store to open, because I was a little early, I saw a tall, dark-haired man with a body I couldn't stop staring at. He must have been at least twice my age, but something about him left me completely fascinated. I stood there like a fool, looking at him, until when he turned around, our eyes met, and his smile made me feel a whirlwind in my stomach. Then I knew I was falling in love with one of the baristas. That was the first time I had ever felt that way about a guy, so I decided I had to see him again. I was so interested in this man that I changed my schedule to match his. I also started arriving before the coffee shop opened, just to wait for him to arrive. That little routine soon became the most exciting part of my days. He always smiled at me, and those moments filled me with joy. It was like every smile of his seemed to take away a little bit of the darkness I had always had in my life. It was as if, for the first time, a spark of hope began to shine in the midst of all the hellish chaos that had been my life up to that point. Every day I was looking forward to that little encounter, dreaming of what it could become. But one day, as I sat there daydreaming, waiting to see that barista who had stolen my heart, I suddenly noticed that it wasn't him entering the coffee shop, but another guy. At first I thought maybe he had fallen asleep or something, so I decided to wait a little longer, giving him the benefit of the doubt. But in the end, time passed and he didn't show up. Later that afternoon, while I was behind the counter serving customers, I saw him again, but he was chatting flirtatiously with a woman. For some reason, his figure sounded familiar, but I couldn't get a good look at his face. Suddenly, I noticed that they began to move closer and closer, and as they did, an uneasiness began to tighten in my chest. It was then that I realized bitterly who the woman was and why she looked so familiar. It was my mother, and now she was having a passionate kiss in the middle of the street with the man I was in love with. At that moment, I felt my heart break, almost literally. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of jealousy, rage, and the desire to rip the face off that shameless and malevolent viper who brought me into the world. Just to make my life miserable, when I saw them kissing like that in front of my tent, a feeling of deep anger came over me, as if all the years of abuse and mistreatment I had endured, all crowded together in the pit of my stomach and began to burn, along with the anger that I was stealing the love of the boy I dreamed of every night. But if they thought it was just a cruel coincidence, they were wrong. When he parted his lips from hers, she turned to look directly at me, and our eyes met for the first time in over a year. Hers shone with a malice I could never have imagined, while mine burned with resentment. Then she looked at him again, grabbed him by the hair, and kissed him again, while my world crumbled around her. She knew I liked him, and what she was doing was a warning. I couldn't have anything because she would take him away from me. The fury I felt at that moment was indescribable. Maybe I should have let this moment pass, but I could not. The next day, things got even worse. While I had my shift at the store, I saw that in the coffee shop my mother walked back in wearing a short dress and started flirting with the barista. This one came out from behind the counter and sat at a table with him, looking very seductive. That image filled me with extreme fury, and as if something inside me snapped, anger blinded me, and I decided I was going to do something about it. So, like an automaton, I went straight to the hardware section, grabbed a wrench, and headed for the coffee shop, hiding the object behind me. She was so engrossed in flirting with the guy that she didn't even notice, but with every step I took, the rage grew more and more, until finally I lunged at her, and with all the strength I had, hit her over the head with the tool. I remember hearing a lot of screaming all around, but none of that mattered at the time. I just let myself be driven by a dark rage and hit her repeatedly until, finally, I felt I had knocked her out. I'm not sure how much time passed, but by the time someone pulled me off, her body lay limp on the ground. Her long dark hair covered her face, and a huge pool of blood had formed around her. It was only at that moment that I was barely conscious of what I had done. I could feel tears and shame building up in my eyes as I looked around at everyone around me. This was made worse by the realization that it had been the barista who had been the person who pulled me away from her and stopped me from hitting her further. Suddenly, he ran over and threw himself on her, screaming and crying. Then he looked at me, and in his eyes there was so much rancor that it almost broke my soul. But, on the other hand, I felt liberated, that I had eliminated the monster that had ruined my life. After a while, I heard the sound of a police siren approaching, and a few moments later, my mother was taken to the hospital. Fortunately, she did not die during my attack, but it was a close call. More like a miracle that she survived, as they say. Weeds never die. As I confessed what I had done, the detective looked at me with an "I can't believe it" face, and I guess I had never had to deal with such a situation before. Although who knows, sometimes people hide their truth behind a mask. After a while, my mother managed to fully recover from her injuries, and surprisingly did not press charges against me, perhaps because she did not want me to tell my truth and ruin her reputation in front of her club of posh friends who thought she was a saint. She preferred to leave me as the unhinged, troubled daughter who attacked her in the middle of a drug crisis or something. In the end, it's always about her, but I don't care anymore. I never went back to my house after that, nor will I ever. I still live with my friend Selma, but now in another city where I resumed my studies and started going to therapy, hoping to start healing. I'm not really sure how to start this, but I think it's best to tell you how I ended up in this situation. I apologize in advance if the story is a bit long, but I have so much to tell. The truth is that I didn't imagine myself in a scenario like this. I'm not a trained warrior or anything like that. I don't consider myself a tough guy at all. Up to that point, I had only touched a gun a couple of times in my life, like when I was playing cannonball in the backyard or with the pinball paintball guns. Rather, my attention had always been on comic books and video games, like any kid my age in high school. After high school, I got into college and got hooked on programming, and that became my forte. Then I finished my degree and got a job at a small company that develops video games. Until 2020, I lived alone, enjoying my independence. But, as you know, that year became a real disaster for the world. But for my family, it would be the beginning of a hell that would change our lives forever. During the pandemic, my mother finally decided to divorce my stepfather. This after enduring years of verbal and physical abuse from him, which was only exacerbated during our quarantine together. She then became solely responsible for taking care of herself and my younger brother, who was only 12 years old. My mother had always been strong, and despite the difficulties, she was getting by. But with the pandemic closures, she lost her job, and that was a huge blow to everyone. So as soon as I heard about it, I didn't hesitate to leave my house and move in with them. I sold everything I could and put the rest of my stuff in a storage room because I couldn't allow my family to be on the street, especially in the middle of a pandemic that was sweeping the world. The lockdown was a mixed experience for us. I was now the breadwinner as my job was largely remote, so it wasn't as affected, but what little money I had saved we used for food and other bills. Fortunately, my mother had always been fond of vintage clothing, so she didn't hesitate to start reselling some of her stuff through Etsy and eBay. And thanks to this financially, at least, we managed to survive. However, as is often the case, wellness is never complete, and my stepfather was still a big problem in our lives. I encouraged her to take out a restraining order against him after kicking him out, but she was still allowed to see my brother. I would have preferred something different, but I didn't consider it fair to separate my brother from his father, as long as he kept his cool and stayed away from Mom. So I decided to stay out of it and avoid any confrontation. Fortunately, the following year, the confinements ended, and we began to slowly get our lives back together. I went back to the office, and my brother finally went back to school, while it didn't take long for my mom to get a part-time job at a bar downtown. It wasn't the ideal situation we all wanted, but at least it was a good start. However, my stepfather's shadow was still hanging over us, and, as always, he couldn't help but ruin everything. He found out where my mom worked, and like a real jerk, started showing up at the bar and causing trouble for her. My mom, who already had a lot of experience dealing with his behavior, especially when he drank, tried to ignore him and put up with his provocations as usual. But that night was different. My stepfather went overboard and, in a fit of madness, threw a glass of beer in her face. Luckily, that night, the bar bullies gave him his comeuppance. I wish I could say that taught him a lesson. As is often the case with these guys, he didn't get the chip, as he stood waiting outside our apartment in a pitiful state. And when my mom arrived, he began to beat her mercilessly, like a crazed dog. Thank God she somehow managed to escape his clutches and take refuge inside the apartment. I was out that night dealing with an important deadline at work. You can't imagine how much I reproach myself for not being there, because if I had been, perhaps what happened next could have been avoided. The next day, I arrived home late, completely tired, and the first image I saw was my mom's face, full of bruises, but mostly of despair. That really made my blood boil. I couldn't take it anymore. Who the hell did that bastard think he was? I was so furious that day that I told my mother that if the police didn't solve this once and for all, I would solve it myself in my own way. I think my mom realized how serious I was being, and it scared her. But instead of stopping me, she seemed to have a plan in mind to put an end to that maniac's abuse without completely ruining our lives. So she asked me to listen to her, and although I was really furious, I decided to listen to her. But in my mind, I kept thinking about calling the authorities. However, she reminded me that we had called the police many times before, and whether it was because of X's or Y's, he always got off scot-free, as if nothing had happened. So instead of continuing with the same story, Mom suggested that we move to a place where it would be more difficult for him to bother us. I looked into it for a moment, and the truth is that it didn't seem like such a bad idea. After all, I could go back to work remotely, and my mom's job at the bar was no big deal. She could easily find something else. Besides, the school district, already not the best option, had become chaotic since the pandemic. We basically had nothing to anchor us there. Even our apartment was rented. But most of all, we needed a way out. I thought it over calmly that day and soon realized that moving somewhere else might be our best option at the time. Maybe I had more to lose, but I figured that, thanks to my profession, I could get something wherever we ended up. So we got our act together and started making preparations that very night. We packed everything we could into the cars, and as we were doing so, I noticed my mom putting her dad's old revolver in her purse. I shot her a surprised look, but she just quickly closed it and went back to work, so I decided not to say anything. After all, that bastard might reappear, and it was better that she had a way to defend herself. The next morning, we got up first thing and hit the road. We didn't tell anyone we were leaving, not even the landlord of the apartment, because the idea was that if anyone needed to know anything, they would find out when we got to our new home. We traveled by caravan all day and only stopped for a quick snack. Around 6 p.m., we finally decided to rent a room for the night, and I ordered a couple of pizzas for dinner. But just as we were about to finish, Mom received a text message from my stepfather. She blanched as she read it, staring at the screen dumbfounded. Seeing her shocked face, I took the phone from her and read the message aloud. "Did you really think I'd let you run off just like that with my son?" My brother and I looked at each other, horrified, and without thinking, darted to the window to look out. I jerked the curtains aside and scanned the parking lot, but it was the worst thing I could have done. At that moment, he saw me first and started running towards our room. I closed the curtains, but it was too late. We could only look at each other in fear as we waited. The silence was eerie. Outside, the sound of his footsteps was getting closer by the second, and a flutter of nerves ran through me from head to toe. Not to mention how my mom was doing. In my mind, I could only compare it to the anxiety of waiting for a bomb to drop. In those moments, I fought the urge to vomit, when little by little, his footsteps became louder. I don't know, man. Okay. No, but it was too late for Mom. She was trapped, and my stepfather grabbed her by the shirt and began punching her in the face with unimaginable brutality. It was a frightening and utterly hopeless scene. Every blow he gave Mom was throwing her backwards as if she were a rag doll. My brother stood there in desperation, begging his dad to stop, while I ran towards him to try to stop him, but he punched me down. He was completely out of control. I had never seen him so furious. He was like a wild animal in a rage. There was no way I could do anything. He was a huge guy, strong, a real battle tank, thanks to years of physical labor as a construction worker. At that moment, I realized that I had reached a critical point, and if I wanted to help Mom, I had to act right away. So without thinking about anything but the urgency of saving my mother, I walked quickly to her purse and took out my grandfather's gun. It all seemed like a bad dream. The only thing I remember is that with 3 quick movements, I pulled the trigger. The noise was dull and my ears were ringing. Then I saw my stepfather pause for a second, looking at me with an expression of total surprise. Crazy as it sounds, he apparently thought he could kill Mom and take my brother with him without anything happening. I was stunned. I could tell he thought he could get away with it, but I snapped out of that thought when I saw him stumble and collapse just outside the door. It was only then that it really dawned on me. Carefully, I stepped over my brother, who was lying on the floor crying, and kicked my stepfather to see if he still reacted, but he did nothing. Finally, I reached my stepfather to see if he still reacted, but he did nothing. I looked at Mom, who was lying unconscious on the floor, her face a mess, and thought she might be dead, which made my heart clench in a fist. At that moment, I put the gun in my pocket and ran to get my phone, and without wasting a second, I called 911 just in case I left the gun in Mom's purse. I didn't want the cops to think I was the problem. Just waiting. As if they weren't going to find out anyway. Fortunately, help arrived quickly and she was taken to the hospital. But I would have to stay with the cops, and it took me no time at all to come clean as soon as they started asking me questions, including our history with him. They asked me the same questions over and over again, probably to make sure I didn't change my story, but after a couple of hours, they seemed to be satisfied, because they let me go to the hospital a few hours later. They told me not to leave town until the matter was cleared up, which didn't matter to me, since the reason we fled had been resolved. They took the gun as evidence, and that bothered me a little because it was my grandfather's service weapon when he was sheriff, and I figured we'd never see it again. In the end, if that was going to be the price to pay for Mom's safety, it was worth it. When I finally got to the hospital, she was in surgery. The doctor gave me a diagnosis that didn't sound good at all. Her face and skull were fractured, and it looked like she had swelling in her brain. There was also fear that she might lose the sight in one of her eyes. But despite all that bad news, I was extremely relieved to learn that she had survived the attack. Now everything was in God's hands. As soon as I left the room, I joined my brother in the waiting room. He seemed to be in shock. The last few hours had been a real emotional turmoil for him. Most adults don't even go through that much in their entire lives. And he, at his young age, had had to deal with all this tragedy, something that broke my heart. I sat next to him and watched him for a while, as he seemed lost in thought. The TV was on, but he was watching it as if his life depended on it. I decided to break the silence by apologizing for what I had done. I wasn't sorry for what I had done, but I felt it was unfair that he had to see it. Then Nicholas turned to me, still thoughtful, and after a moment's reflection, he said, "It's okay. She was in danger. She loved him, but he was a monster. Don't feel bad. Mom is alive because of you." His response left me speechless and with a knot in my heart. I'd never seen him express such intense feelings before. I was speechless, and all I could do was give him a big hug. A few hours later, Mom came out of surgery and they let us in to see her. I tried to prepare my mind for what I was going to find, but I was shocked by her appearance anyway. Her head looked almost twice as big and was completely bandaged except for thin tubes coming out of it. I managed to hold it together just barely, but my brother was another story. He was in floods of tears, and I didn't blame him. Seeing his own mother like that was not something a child should have to face. I was holding back the tears myself, so he wouldn't see how broken down I was inside. The next week was a long pull of waiting and watching. The hospital was letting us sleep there, so that was a relief. Plus, they had gotten us a new motel room so we could rest in a real bed or just hang out. But fortunately, my mother recovered well, and by the time she was finally discharged, she had scraped together enough to rent a new apartment, more spacious and comfortable than the old one. Since then, Mom's health has had ups and downs, but in general, everything has been going very well, or much better than when we had my stepfather's shadow over us. Even Nicholas is much happier now and hardly ever talks about him. As for me, I found a new job where I get paid very well, enough to continue to support my family and pay for my mother's medical expenses. But overall, everything is much better now. Oh, and due to the circumstances under which everything happened, the police determined that I acted in self-defense, and my action was necessary to save my mother's life. So, I did not face any charges. When I was little, my friend Louie and I set up a nice sleepover at his house. His mom and dad had split up a couple of months ago, so to help him get through the rough patch, she went all out. Not that she was spoiling him, but she was giving him a lot of things to cheer him up and make him feel good. Truth be told, it had its perks. Sleepovers with friends, a new Xbox and a new cell phone, plus more freedom. But there were times when you could tell the issue was hitting him hard. The thing is, thanks to that situation, I was able to be closer to him and offer him the support he needed, which, ironically, got me into one of the worst experiences of our childhood. We were in the middle of a sleepover, and his mother invited a friend who was running a little late. At one point, I got thirsty and decided to go get a glass of water in the kitchen. To do that, I had to go through the TV room, and when I did, I ran into his mom's friend, a guy who was clearly too close to her to be just any friend. As we walked in, they parted quickly with the typical reaction of someone who was caught in something they didn't want them to see. I was like, "Okay, it's fine, don't look at me," as I walked back with my water, feeling super uncomfortable. When I got to the room, I mentioned the issue to Louis, and that was a monumental mistake that I infinitely regret to this day. It was clear to me right away that he was not amused that his mom was with a guy. We were just high school kids at the time, so we didn't understand a lot of things, and for Louis, this was something unacceptable. In a way, he still wasn't over the fact that his mom was no longer with his dad, and he could get his life together. For a moment, I thought he would go downstairs and kick the guy out of the house, but instead, he did something much worse. He texted his dad that there was a guy in his house with his mother. I couldn't believe what he was doing, and I felt terrible. I knew the weather was already complicated, and now it was threatening to get worse. When he hung up, he turned to me with a forced smile and blurted out that his dad was coming. And that's when I knew my fears had come true, and a storm was coming. Why couldn't I keep my mouth shut? I thought to myself. I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, but at the same time, my mission was to be a good friend to Louis, and I couldn't leave him alone, dealing with what was coming. In my house, everything was peace and love. My parents were always together until my dad passed away, and I thought that was the normal thing to do, at least until I saw what was going on in Louis' life. This gave me a mixture of pity and guilt for not wanting to stay. However, I had a hunch that disaster was imminent, but I had no idea how ugly it was going to get. My friend's room overlooked the entrance to his house, so when his dad finally arrived, we could see and hear most of it. This guy didn't mess around. He drove down the driveway at full speed, slammed on the brakes, and didn't even bother to close the door before getting out of the car. Thomas stared at him as if his dad was a superhero on his white horse, until he suddenly blurts out to me, "Oh no, I think my dad has a gun." That sentence sent chills down my spine and a fist in my stomach. I was already anticipating that this could end in yelling and brawling, but gunfire. This was another level of chaos that I was definitely not prepared for. So there we were, listening from the open window as Louis' dad started banging on the door like crazy, asking where the guy was, and his mom, trying to play it cool, told him she didn't know what he was talking about. But in the blink of an eye, the man went crazy and yelled at his mother, "Don't lie to me, Lena. Where is he? Open the door or I'll break it down." The tension was palpable, and I could feel the nervousness enveloping us all. I couldn't help but feel guilty about the chaos. Then his mom blurted out, "Who told you that?" And I was scared to death because I knew I was the one who had spoken. In that instant, I felt totally guilty. Louis's dad burst out, "You're a damn liar, Lena. Get out of my way." Suddenly, we heard one more shout over the din, and then came one more guy yelling, "You want to see me? I'm coming." These words were followed by a deafening silence. Then, we started to hear footsteps on the first floor. That's when, bam, 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 3 shots in a row echoed throughout the house. Now, Lewis and I, we were in a ball of nerves, unable to process what was going on. My friend's mom was now screaming and crying her eyes out, and I didn't know if her boyfriend had been shot, if he had a gun and shot Lewis's dad, or if she had been shot herself. Oh, we didn't know what was going on. The weather was too intense, and to top it off, I had to take Lewis's cell phone away from him to call 911. He was so nervous he couldn't seem to talk. He was already dealing with his separation, and now this. I couldn't blame him for being in shock. 3 gunshots, and now all we could hear was Thomas's mom crying in despair. Shut up. We knew we should have gone down to see what was going on, but the operator told us to stay put, as we didn't know who the shooter was and if he was still there. We did as we were eventually told. Luckily, everyone was all right in the end. It turns out that Lewis's dad had gone straight to confront his mom's friend, and as soon as he saw him, he pointed the gun at him. But seeing that his contender was armed, the friend was quick and managed to run out the back of the house. Then Lewis's dad chased him, firing 3 shots, but he was just trying to scare him. It felt like a big sandbag was lifted off my back when I knew no bullets had hit him. However, what happened was terrifying, and in the end, Lewis's dad ended up back behind bars for quite a while.